All right, we'll go ahead and get it kicked off. So today we have Patrick presenting 10 things that every game needs. It's a talk based off of an article that he didn't write. Just one announcement today, make sure you request your mid-year reviews if you haven't already. That's pretty much it. So yeah, you can go ahead and get started.
Cool. Okay, so again, I haven't met everybody in the room, but my name is Patrick, and this is a presentation based on an article that I did write, as Ryan said, basically outlining 10 things every game needs. We'll talk a little bit about who wrote the article and why it exists and why I love it. But generally, since most of us here, I think, are developers, and we like to know how things work under the hood. So if we are people who play a lot of games, I am one of those people. So I certainly enjoy having a little bit of a glimpse into what makes a game more enjoyable for me, and some ideas that might have gone through developers' head as they were making it. So fun is a hard thing to quantify, but that's pretty much the goal of any game, whether it's something hundreds of years old like chess, or something like Coup, which is relatively recent. I mean, the whole idea behind a game, for the most part, is fun. But as hard as it is, that's what we're trying to figure out how to do. How do we make a game fun? How do we make a game enjoyable? And it's tough because everyone enjoys games for different reasons. Some people just want to be there for the challenge. Some people want to get sucked into the world that the game creates for you. Some people just want to be around their friends, just use games as an excuse. But either way, there are commonalities between what makes a game successful and what makes a game flop. And in some cases, whether or not a game is even a game. So my goal is to provide you with questions that you can ask when you're playing a game that hopefully can give you a better understanding and appreciation for how the game was made, how it compares to other games, just generally a new lens to use whenever you're playing a game to decide whether it's good or just something interesting, an interesting element to add to how you play games. We're mostly just going to talk about traditional board games, card games, that kind of stuff. This isn't really inclusive of things like sports games or like most video games. It's a little bit different, but generally we're talking about games where you sit down with other people, other person, around a board, around some dice, around something, and play. So this is a guy, Mark Rosewater. He's the head designer of Magic: The Gathering, and I promise, for those who don't play Magic, I'm not going to talk about nothing but Magic. In fact, I'll barely touch it. But he worked as a designer since 1996 there, which Magic started in '93. And if anybody is unfamiliar with it, it's kind of a huge empire. I mean, it's actually created the collectible card game market. So Pokemon, Yu-Gi-Oh, all of these things that we have now. Magic was the precursor to all of it. And he got started early on. He started designing Magic puzzles as well as doing coverage and promotion for events, tours, new products, that sort of stuff, and he eventually joined the design team and became a head designer in '03. Interestingly enough, his training is actually in writing, and he previously wrote for the sitcom Roseanne. He has 2 episodes credited to his name. But either way, he's just kind of an excellent mind when it comes to game design. He's been doing it for over 20 years, or for 20 years, I guess. Yeah, he has a regular column on the Magic website that goes into all sorts of facets, mostly about Magic, but then just general topics as well. So the article's written by him, and it's part of his column on the website, and it's based on a speech he gave to his daughter's 5th grade class. They had an assignment that involved them creating their own board game for the Revolutionary War, which is kind of a funny, dark thing for a 5th grader to do, but that's fine. I'm sure everybody did this at some point in school. I know, like, even in high school, I had to create a board game based on grade expectations, which is not a fun thing. Trying to extract fun from that book is challenge in itself. But anyway, his goal was to refine the essentials of game design into just one basic handout that fifth graders could understand. And he went back later and wrote the article based on that handout, listing these 10 things. The article mostly spends time relating it to Magic, but I thought it'd be interesting instead to relate it to some of the board games that we play in the office and some other games that you might be familiar with. That's not a game I made. That's just very reminiscent of a game I would have made in fifth grade. Okay, so the very first element that a game needs is a goal or goals. So there needs to be a point for your game. What are your players trying to do? How do they win? So it's important that this goal should be something that players want to do by themselves. So the game stick needles in your face is not necessarily a good goal because that's not something you're going to do a lot of work trying to convince your players to do that. On the other hand, One Night Ultimate Werewolf, if you're unfamiliar with it, has a very simple goal. Somebody's a werewolf. Figure out who it is, kill them. You're done, right? Risk, global domination. Very straightforward, simple goals. And so, yes, that's the idea that the number one principle of a game has to be a goal. This is usually the first thing you say when you're instructing somebody how to play. You say, well, you're trying to take over the world. Or, you're trying to figure out who a werewolf is and not get killed or survive or something. I mean, that's the basic premise. What's interesting is when you take some really well-known games and try to bottle the goal into a pitch the same way. So for example, like Monopoly, we all have played it, we all know how to kind of play it, but the goal of it's kind of ambiguous because it's really more of a survivalist game as opposed to what it feels like. I mean, it feels like you're buying things and you're trading property, but like the goal is make a bunch of money, except that doesn't win. Or it's don't be poor, except that still doesn't win. Like it's the goal of that's kind of ambiguous, except be the last man standing, which is kind of a weird spin on Monopoly. And then you have kids games, which is the same way, which is like Candyland. The goal is get to candy. I honestly don't like that. That's one where it's like get across the board. Okay, so it's really straightforward, but it's also not something that's instantly grokkable or instantly like summed up. So that's one, is a goal. Number two is rules. There needs to be a list of what players are and are not allowed to do. So restrictions are an important part of a game. Accomplishing your goal shouldn't be too easy. So one of Mark Rosewater's personal credos is that restrictions breed creativity. That's how he operates. So the idea with rules too is it's not just a framework of how to play, but it's also built to encourage people to play the way that they're supposed to, right? A game with way too many rules that's just nothing but what you can't do isn't an effective game because it doesn't encourage your players to play in a natural, straightforward way. So there are simple rules like Candyland. I don't know the last time I play Candyland every week, but I don't know what other people are doing. But the rule is draw a card and do what the card says, right? Move to the next colored space. Great, you're done. Like the rules of Candyland are super simple. Uno has simple rules as well, right? It's essentially number or color, go, keep going, right? Like these are all very simple frameworks. Then you have games that are incredibly complex. On the left, that's the board for a game called Arkham Horror, which if anyone has played before, I've played that game at least half a dozen times, and at the end of every session, somebody picks up the rule book and says, "Oh, we missed this. Like we forgot to do this." Like it's ridiculous. And then you have this is a sample Magic the Gathering card. Where, I mean, even blown up to that size, you can barely read the text on the card. This is one of the more complicated examples, but like Magic has something like 12,000 different cards that do different things. So rules escalate to a complicated level. So, I mean, that's okay when you have more rules. It's usually because players are allowed to do more things. But at the same time, it can become overwhelming. Settlers of Catan is an interesting example because the rules are pretty simple, and you do the same three phases every round. If you haven't played Settlers, you get resources, you build stuff, and you trade with other people for your resources in order to conquer this island, essentially. But there's a rule that says you have to nobody can have a max hand size greater than 7, which is kind of like an obvious rule because most card games usually impose some kind of max hand size. But interesting about it is instead of just being a arbitrary restriction, it actually forces players to make actions, right? So if you have a max hand size of 7, and at any given point in time, something might cause you, if you go over that limit, now you have to lose half your hand, that's going to encourage people to do things, right? That's like we talked about, that's going to encourage people to take actions towards the goal, which is an interesting way, like where a rule seems like it's just imposing some arbitrary restriction, but in actuality, it's encouraging gameplay. So that's what good rules tend to do. Another common theme in games is that rules are literally made to be broken, in that the basic outline, the instruction manual will say, here are the rules, here's how you play, and then actions you take in the game allow you to bypass rules, tweak them, or anything like that. So Uno, for example, like you can think of Uno essentially as just like an automatic machine. Like you make a choice, and okay, I play a 3, I play a green card, whatever. But then some, again, arbitrary restriction happens. When you play your second to last card, you have to say Uno, right? Like that's in the rules, but it's also changing the fundamental framework of the basic premise. So that's just another way to think about rules. Encouraging gameplay as opposed to just restricting it, as well as tweaking itself as the game changes. So number 3 is interaction. As I said, we're talking about board games that you typically play with other people, so generally not solitaire. But there needs to be some aspect of the game that encourages players to react to one another. What does your game do to make players interact? So by that, it's not just you're playing with other people, but you're interacting with the other people. You're not sitting around a table playing solitaire together, right? So Sorry is an interesting example because generally, Sorry is you have to move around the board to get your pieces from home all the way around back to goal. Very straightforward and simple, and you do this by drawing a card and moving numbers. There's actually very little player interaction. You could play that game by yourself, and it would be very similar. The only difference is if by random chance somebody lands on the same space as you, you go back to the start, right? That is minimal player interaction compared to something like Resistance or Avalon or Werewolf or Coup, which are all games literally based on nothing but interaction. People shouting at one another, people making decisions together, like that's interaction, not just people sitting around moving pieces. This is a game called Carcassonne. If people haven't played it, basically you keep on adding tiles, and if you create certain patterns, you get to claim land and get points and that sort of thing. But this is a good game. I really like it. But the more I've played it, the more I find it to be very much playing solitaire with other people. Like you're all forming a board together, but you're not much. Like you could just be sitting in a room with a black box making the same decisions, and it would be very similar. Like, which is why the mobile phone game is so easy or so like straightforward, is because it's fine, it works. So sometimes it works just fine, and you can still have a complex, interesting game that way. But generally, games strive for interaction, and that interaction can be multiple ways. It can just be incidental, like Sorry. It can be cooperative. So Forbidden Island is a game that's essentially everybody's on an island. The island is sinking. You got to get off the island, and everybody has to get off the island. So that's an example of a game where you're working together. Everybody's taking individual turns, making their own decisions, but the goal is to work as a team. And then you also have competitive games, which are the most obvious standard. Sorry is competitive, Carcassonne is competitive, Settlers of Catan is competitive, Monopoly is competitive. These are all games that you interact with one another as adversaries, not as companions. So that's just another example. Poker is another example of like kind of weird interaction because again, you're sitting around a table with other people and you care about what they're doing, but it's more subtle. It's not like I'm taking this poker player's card and I'm looking at your hand, or like it's not as direct. It's much more just dependent on what other people are doing to play the game. So it's just another kind of interesting way. And some other games, and this struck me as kind of interesting, but like Trivial Pursuit is like not a multiplayer game. Like it's you could just sit there with a bunch of trivia cards and read them to yourself and try to guess. The only thing that makes it competitive is somebody might know more than you. And so it's, in terms of it being a game compared to just a challenge of some sort, that's just an interesting question, is like how the gaminess, if you will, of some games. So number 4, and this one's kind of an interesting one, is the catch-up feature. So there needs to be a way for players that have fallen behind to catch up. A game becomes frustrating if a player feels like he or she has no chance to win. So most games have some degree of this, and it's more exaggerated in some than in others. It's usually dependent on chance. Very rarely can somebody just decide, I'm ahead of you now. That wouldn't be much of a game. And it usually either makes whoever's in the lead, makes the game more challenging for them, or it eases up on whoever's falling behind. And this is hugely responsible in terms of letting people want to still play a game, right? Like if in the first 5 rounds it was obvious, well, they're in the lead, I'm done for, nobody keeps playing that game. So, you know, that's, yeah, people want hope, people want the chance to win. Now, what's interesting is that games that are incredibly strategy reliant tend to minimize catch-up features. So for example, chess does not really have a catch-up feature, right? There's no piece in chess that says, you know, oh, if you kill this piece, you get 2 free pawns. Like if you're behind, yeah.
But what about like moving pawn back to the queen?
Yeah, absolutely. So that could be considered a catch-up feature. Generally, that's a difficult position to get to, right? Like that's something that typically happens. If you're enabling that to happen, you're probably doing fine already. Like it's not something you can sneak by. It's not like, it tends to be a strategy in itself. Is I'm sacrificing this rook in order to get this pawn to convert into a queen, right? So and that's still a trade. Like that's something you have to set up turns in advance, many turns in advance, right? So that's an interesting angle though too, where it's like, okay, pieces can get stronger, but it tends to be what's considered a win more, right? Where it's like, yeah, you've elevated some piece, but the person who's doing that tends to have already been in a good position. I mean, not all the time, definitely. And I'm not a chess grandmaster or anything, so you know somebody else might have more to say. But the way that when I've played, it always, you know, it seems to me like that's something you're setting up in advance. And again, there's no real chance in chess, right? I'm not saying a catch-up feature has to be chance-based, but generally they are, and chess is a purely strategy game. So I don't know if anyone's played Small World, but that's another great global domination type game. And it's a strategy game. There's a board. You've got your creatures and your races, and you're trying to conquer different regions of the board. But it's kind of interesting because unlike Risk or one of those games where you have the same army, your Small World army keeps on dying out, and you get a new one, and dies out, and you get a new one. And those combinations can be, you know, somewhat random in terms of what you're going to get next. And so that's an interesting example of, well, maybe the next combination that you get is actually really good, and you didn't, you know, it popped up there and it works really good against what was set up previously. So it's a game with kind of like a little reset button every so often, which is an interesting way to catch up. Chutes and Ladders has like just the most arbitrary catch-up feature, which is literally you spin the spinner, and if you you know, oh, you have a ladder, great, you win the game, or you hit a chute, you're back at the beginning. Right? So that's the simplest example of a catch-up feature. But yeah, in a strategy game where there's no variance in the game, nothing's going to surprise you per se of like originating from the game, catch-up features tend to be minimized. But even in like really strategic games like Scrabble, for example, which is very just, you know, can you build words? Like you have triple word scores that if you manage to get one of those can catch you up, and you know maybe you pull that cube from the bag and great, 10 points. So they're there even if they're kind of hidden. Inertia is another one. So there needs to be something in your game that moves it along towards completion. You have to have something built into your game that makes sure it ends. So this is, I mean, Monopoly is really bad at this if you play it incorrectly. If you play it by the rules, which nobody actually really does, it tends to be okay. But I mean, Monopoly is one of those games where, you know, it should have ended 4 hours ago, which is like 2 hours after everybody else left. Like it's not great. Checkers is a really simple game, and inertia is built into it because your pieces can only move forward until one game. So that game is, the rules literally say you have to keep playing. You can't stall, right? Some tools are mechanical, like the rules of checkers. Some are external like catchphrase, there is a timer. So the inertia is from the beeping that is keep on, trying to tell you you're out of time. Keep playing, keep going, etc. Forbidden Island, I talked about that earlier. The way that the island is thinking is you've got a deck of cards, and every now and then you will draw this card that says the island seems a little bit more like things just got tougher. So you don't have time to just wander around exploring the island, doing whatever you want to do, because you're going to drown. So that's another example of mechanics built in. Ticket to Ride is an interesting example because the game itself, I don't know if you've played before, but basically you're trying to connect the United States by all sorts of train lines. So you're trying to claim each one of those lines represents a different line. That if you have the right number of cars and the right colors, you can claim this line. But you also get mini goals essentially of try to claim this line, try to claim this line. It's not just a free-for-all. That's interesting because as opposed to just a game where I'm trying to claim as much as I can, you get these concrete, very clearly outlined goals, which are much easier to grok. So it's not a matter of timer or a matter of mechanics. It's like a psychological inertia of, oh, this is much more straightforward. I can try to do this. So it makes it a little bit simpler. And there's a great quote from the article that it's a well-crafted game should end before the players want to stop playing. And yeah, so that's something that never really occurred to me until I really thought about the games. Like the best games, when you play them, people want to play again immediately, right? Like that was great, let's go again. And so inertia really helps that. Okay, so surprise. There needs to be elements of your game the players cannot predict. People enjoy being surprised. You have to make sure that your game has moments that are unexpected. So the interesting thing to me is where this happens in different games. This is generally information that's hidden from the players, but it can be hidden from the player by another player. It can be hidden from the player by the game itself. It can be hidden just by strategy. So Yahtzee, for example, that literally is just called surprise, right? I mean, you roll some dice and you don't know what's going to happen. And then eventually, maybe you'll get the Yahtzee and you get to shout a word that's fun to shout, and everybody has a great time. But that's a game that's built completely around surprise. Betrayal is another one. That's an interesting game where you're exploring a haunted house, essentially. But the map, it's not just a static board. There are tiles that you place for rooms as you explore. So the surprise there is that you don't know what's going to happen in the game. Like you don't know what you're going to find in each room. And at the same time, something happens in that game where at some point, somebody randomly determined turns against you, right? So you got more surprise there. It's baked in. But at the same time, there are clear rules that allow you to not be completely blindsided, right? Like it's not just rolling the dice like Yahtzee. You can still strategize and have goals. This surprise element really improves depth of play, right? We stopped playing tic-tac-toe at some point as kids because, one, the game is like solved, right? I mean, if you go first, you can win if you know what to do. But until you really know what that means as a kid, essentially it's the same thing over and over again. Like a Y isn't going to suddenly show up in one of the squares. It's very straightforward. There's nothing going on. So games with surprise and with chance improve depth of play and replayability. Surprise doesn't have to be mechanical. Those are examples that we gave before. It can also be psychological or personal or funny. So Cards Against Humanity, for example, the surprise in that game comes from just the absurdity that people create, right? It's literally like cards that exist are so bizarre and so crude, or the combinations that you make are so bizarre or crude that it's surprising besides just being funny, right? So that's an example of the surprise coming from interaction as opposed to coming from the game. And then you have games like the Pokemon trading card where there's surprise in the game, but there's also surprise in the product itself. Like any trading card game, you don't know what you're going to get. You're not even playing the game yet, and it's managed to impose surprise on you. So that's just an interesting element there. On the opposite side, though, is when you have too much surprise. Like Yahtzee is almost guilty of this. Like, how do you strategize when every turn is I don't know what's going to happen? So it can go either way. I wanted to include an example of some subtle surprise. So like Robo Rally, I don't know if anybody's played that. Essentially, you have a board and you have a robot and you have cards to program what the robot's going to do. And you have to get him to like get to certain points on the board. So cards will say, move forward 4 spaces, turn left, turn 180 degrees, like move backwards, that kind of stuff. And you lay them out in order, and then everybody executes their robots essentially at the same time, or in order determined by the game. So you've programmed your robot to move on the board. If you're the only one playing, it does exactly what you expect it to do. But when you're playing with, I think this game supports 2 to 8 people. So when you have 8 other people who have robots on the board, moving around in pre-programmed ways that you can't account for, the surprise essentially comes from failure, which is really interesting when a robot accidentally pushes somebody into a pit or onto a conveyor belt that shoves them off the board or something like that. So that's a more subtle surprise because that's a game that's mechanically incredibly like predetermined or programmed until you actually execute. So that's kind of interesting. So then Candyland and Chutes and Ladders are another, talking about simple kid games earlier, examples of surprise being baked in. That's all they have, right? If you were to play Candyland with like the cards facing up, or Chutes and Ladders with like a list of moves, that's not a game anymore. Like you're just going through the motions. So those aren't even games if you take away the element of surprise. Strategy. So we talked about it a little bit, but in terms of it being a core concept, there needs to be something in your game that allows people to get better over time. The reason people like playing games, again, is that they want to use knowledge from past games to do better in future games. So the key element for these is essentially, can you get better at this game over time, right? Like, does strategy matter? And I think it's interesting because certain games, Balderdash, if you haven't played, it's a game where essentially you make up definitions to words and you try to figure out what the right definition is. It's a really fun, underrated game. I really want to push Balderdash. But games like that, games like Pictionary, charades, party games, that's a hard strategy. I mean, if a strategy is getting better at drawing, then I guess that matters. But it's tough to really consider like over time, I'm really good at Pictionary unless you're already a good artist. There are some elements, right, like knowing how to draw quickly or shorten symbols or condense things. But it's tough. The game of life, I think this is really interesting because it's this game full of pieces, super complicated board. You gotta handle money, you got different roles, but you make 3 or 4 decisions at the beginning of the game and then basically go on autopilot. It's just waiting to see what happens to you. Occasionally you get to make an additional choice with some things, when to buy or whatever. But this complicated board is actually just a rail going one way or another. You don't get to choose, if you there are these predetermined stop signs that just say, nope, you gotta do this. So it's tough to strategize much around life when the majority of the tiles just say, this happens, here's $50, or this happens, get a lifetime. Chess is another example. We talked about it already, but it's pure strategy, right? That's it. Chess is built to be just get better at it. And at that point, it's when you're playing at that super high level, it's is this still a game? Is this just a challenge? Is this closer to sports where it's just a competition of skill? So an interesting aspect, Battlestar Galactica, the board game, if anyone's played that, that's a really interesting example of where it feels like you're doing all of this strategizing, and you are. There are a million decisions to make, and it's very challenging. You have to plan for a whole lot, but there are so many elements to this game that what you consider strategy also, it's just because you're making a million decisions doesn't mean you're really planning for things, right? It doesn't mean that you're actually improving over time. And then Seven Wonders, if you haven't played, that's essentially a draft game where people are passing cards to one another and you're picking the best ones to get points or do whatever it is, build wonders, build an army. But what's interesting is that's a game that has an example of multiple strategies. That means you don't have to just get better at one game, right? Chess is getting better at one game, or there are many strategies to do, but it's pretty much the same. Everyone's working with the same pieces. Seven Wonders has multiple strategies that directly counteract one another that are easier to pick up So strategy can be something that you allow multiple avenues that don't necessarily overlap in order to win. Okay, fun. I kind of feel bad that it's all the way here at number 8, but there needs to be something that allows the players to enjoy themselves. The number one reason people play games is for entertainment. If your game isn't fun to play, people won't want to play it. Fun, as we talked about earlier, is hard. It is a difficult thing to plan for. It's unpredictable, and it can come from a million different places and a million different people, right? Some people get fun just from winning. Some people just want to get sucked into the lore. Some people, want to really strategize and be a puppet master and have pieces in play all over the place. But it needs to be there. And it tends to be, as Rosewater talks about in the article, it tends to be the thing that people forget. They spend so much time on building this game and perfecting the rules that they forget to actually make it entertaining. Yeah, so there is a risk of, and this is, so just something to consider, there's a risk of an inverse relationship between strategy and fun, only because if you ever played like chess or Magic or any of those games against somebody who is a million times better than you, it's tough to have fun in that situation when it's a competitive setting, right? Like if you really enjoy playing a game, you're gonna have a good time. But like imagine somebody who's never played chess sitting down with somebody who's played their whole life and trying to have a good time. Like it doesn't work. So one of the ways around that is reducing the domination of strategy in these games. So games that have elements of chance, that have catch-up features that can make amateur players feel like, oh, I've still got a chance, like I can catch up here. That's an example of like fun working because the game isn't dominated by planning and strategy. Yeah, so a couple examples of if games are fun. Monopoly is one that always gets talked about. There's a lot of Monopoly hate in the game world right now. There's a really good 99% Invisible, if you don't remember that podcast, like just tearing the game apart. And it's kind of interesting because Monopoly's a game everybody has like fond and terrible memories of, but it's a game that starts out a ton of fun. You're getting money, you're moving around the board, you're buying stuff, you get chance cards, somebody goes to jail, but then it slowly like peters off as it turns into just like, okay, well, somebody has to win. So that's a game that like has fun in it, but the fun does not really align with the goal of the game, unless you win, in which case the fun comes from rubbing it in everybody's faces afterwards. So that's fine. Uno is kind of interesting because that's a really simple game that doesn't take much thought. You pick a card, but I swear, and hopefully you agree, there's nothing more satisfied than playing a wild draw 4 card. Like that's the most fun thing to do to somebody like in a card game ever. But yeah, so there's that. I have what I think is the most fun game. That was a White Elephant gift. It's a game called Jumpin' Monkeys, and it's literally you have these monkeys and catapults, and you have to get them onto the tree. And if you get all your monkeys up there first, you win a banana. Like it's really silly and straightforward, but like my friends and I used to play we play a 3-hour game of Risk and then be angry at each other. So we would take out Jumpin' Monkeys and play that. And I think I have a commercial on here. I don't know if it's gonna. I just think it's the best thing. Ooh, some feedback. I mean, these kids are having a great time. Bananas! It's just great. Sorry, it's my own indulgence. But like that's a game really straightforward. Minimal rules, but it's just built to be just a fun thing to do. Launching things in the air is fun. So yeah, the fun doesn't have to come necessarily from the rules. Okay, number 9 is flavor. So besides having mechanics, a game wants to have a trapping. It wants to be about something. Sometimes this comes first and the game is built around it. Sometimes the mechanics come first and a flavor is found to match it. Either way, games are more fun if the elements of the game refer to a story or an environment or a theme. And this is true for just about every game. I mean, every modern game that we play, board games, right? Like Monopoly is you're buying houses, you're dominating the city, like you're doing all this stuff. Risk, you're conquering the world. Like if if the game was literally just move pieces around a board, like if that's what the, it was called, that's not fun for anybody. What's interesting is that some games like are really dependent on flavor. Like I know for me, games like Betrayal, which is the haunted house game, like every card feels like you're reading a horror story, or the game, like that. There's the tiles are decorated to look like it. So I mean, a key component of that game is the horror genre, and without it, it wouldn't feel much like something. But it's important to always remember, like the flavor of the game that you're playing is completely separate from the mechanics, the rules of the game. They're inspiring one another, but like you could play the game without any of the flavor trapping. I don't recommend it, but you can do it. So Magic the Gathering, since Rosewater wrote the article and he's the head designer of Magic, he talks a lot about flavor in Magic because the first time I ever heard flavor referring to this concept was in articles about Magic. And like that's both artworks that are on cards that you're playing with. Like those are incredibly detailed, beautiful, epic looking like creatures that like tell a story in themselves. But the Magic itself is an incredibly mechanical game with complex, balancing of resources and keeping track of numbers and life totals and all this stuff. But every card has gorgeous artwork, has some sort of quote that like has to do with the story. I mean, it's probably the most mechanically diverse game out there, but they understand how important it is to tie it all back to the flavor of like mage duels, and that's just fun. So like that's an extreme example, but other games, like it's really kind of interesting to see how simple like the flavor is just sort of tacked on. So this is a game called Ghost. It's actually called Ghost because it's like 7 O's in it. It's a fun game by Richard Garfield, who also invented Magic, as many other games. But it's essentially like a combination of Uno and Egyptian rat screw, except again haunted house themed. There is a graveyard, not just a discard pile. The game is divided into before and after midnight. You're not trying to get rid of your library, your deck. You're trying to empty your haunted mansion of ghosts. But it's just a bunch of cards with numbers on it. Like you could play this with a standard deck of cards and it would be just fine. So that's another example. But other games that are famous historical games don't use flavor at all. Like the flavor of poker, it's not. It's just playing with other people. You're manipulating cards. There's that. Yahtzee, Dominoes, Scrabble, Connect Four. I mean, these are all more strategy games that don't really rely on flavor to have fun. Some game like chess, it's kind of there. I mean, the pieces aren't arbitrary pieces, right? Like it's a knight, it's a king, it's a queen. Like very few people play chess and are picturing like a battlefield with pawns charging at one another. But it's there. I mean, it's helpful because we have an analogy for all these pieces. But I mean that's flavor. But yeah, so it also helps from a rules perspective because when you're playing the game, flavor will encourage you to do what you already want to do. Right? Magic's a duel. It will encourage you to keep fighting with wizards. You want to empty your haunted mansion. But at the same time, the mechanics, you're not doing exactly what the flavor of it is, right? You're not really killing another wizard with a fireball. You're putting a card on the table that's causing an arbitrary number to decrease, and then putting that card in another pile. That's what the game is, and you carry that flavor apart from it. Except jumping monkeys. You're literally launching monkeys onto a tree. That is a great example of flavor matching with mechanics. So finally, a hook. Is the last element. If you want people to play your game, there has to be something about it that encourages people to want to try it. If you're selling your game, the hook is what you use to market it. I'm convinced that the only reason people want to play Sorry is to imitate the commercial and knock somebody off the track and say sorry. Like that's the hook of Sorry, right? Pokemon, the hook, you gotta catch them all. Like there's your hook, right? That's how you grab people into the game. Like Magic, as I said earlier, is the first collectible card game, and you're not just opening new things, you're accumulating cards. Some cards are more rare than others, but that's how you sell this thing. Pie Face sells itself, which this is a real game where you literally make a pie, and it's kind of like hot potato, except you get a pie in the face if you lose. Like you don't need a hook for that. Like the game is its own hook, which just blows me away that exists. Flavor, as we talked about earlier, comes in handy when it comes to the hook, right? Because it's tough to sell a game that's, oh yeah, you're going to put new tiles down and you don't know what's going to be there, and then at the end of the game, someone's going to be against everybody else. Like that sounds kind of compelling. You're going to sit around a table and you're going to shout at one another and say, no, he's lying. No, he's lying. No, I'm the good person. Like that's one way to put it. But when you frame that with you're exploring a haunted house, or you're going on missions and you have to figure out who the spy is, or like, those sorts of flavor hooks will rope people in much faster and much better than just a purely mechanical outlining of what the game is. So hooks and flavors can go hand in hand. Yeah, and that's it. So hopefully this was just a nice casual presentation about games, and maybe it gave you some new ways to look at games, to consider why something is in a game. If anybody is going to go make a board game, I encourage you to include all 10 of these rules. Otherwise, yeah, I just thought it was an interesting way to change how we play games. So, any questions, comments? The article, the link to the actual article is in the invitation. As I said, it's very heavy, and I like comparing these things to Magic. So if you're not a Magic player, it might be tough to parse half of it, but the other half, we're just talking about the concepts, are definitely valuable. So cool. Yeah.
What are your favorite board or card games to play?
My favorite what?
Board or card games.
I mean, Magic is closest to my heart. I play that here almost every Friday. But I mentioned Betrayal. Arkham Horror is another one that I really like, despite the rules being impossible. So I'm a sucker for flavor with games. As long as the game works, if it's a world I want to occupy, I'll play it. But yeah, I mean, those are my big ones. And then, Resistance is so easy and quick to play that I never get tired of that. And there's another game called Red Dragon Inn that I didn't talk about, but it's the premise, and again, it's, sucker for flavor, but the premise is it's like, a bunch of adventurers go to a dungeon and collect treasure and do whatever, and here's what happens after that when they all go back to the tavern and get drunk. Like that's, and so the game is essentially like, trying to keep your intoxication level low, but also, not dying, and also there's gambling involved, kind of. Like it's a real arbitrary, weird concoction that turns into a ton of fun. It's a real meta game, because you're playing cards describing like what would happen, but you're not actually doing any of it. I don't know. It's interesting, but those are mine. So yeah.
So you mentioned Betrayal and Arkham Horror.
Mm-hmm.
Similar vein, but obviously a game like, so Betrayal you might get done in maybe like 2 hours or something.
Yeah.
Arkham Horror could go all night. Do you have a preference between? Do you have a preference or penchant for longer games? And also, the follow-up question would be something like Arkham. Do you like games to where you very well probably won't win? Arkham Horror is one of those games where rarely wins.
Right.
So.
Yeah. Well, that goes back to what I was saying earlier about Arkham, where I think, like I said, I played like 6 or 7 times, probably more. But the only times I've won is when we realized, oh, this rule that was supposed to kill us like 9 turns ago, whoops, we forgot about that. Like, but so I suppose when it comes to it, like I would say I probably have a penchant for longer games in the grand scheme, only because this European style board game, that I tend to play, those tend to be a little bit longer than, say, a 20-minute game of Stratego, or something like what a traditional board game tends to be. And yeah, so the length of the game, I tend to have a really good attention span for them. I'm happy to just sit and play for 6 hours, like as long as the trappings of the game are interesting enough, and the people I'm playing with are entertaining me enough, I guess. But at the same time, like Resistance, those games, or Werewolf, they last like 5 minutes, you know? I mean, well, Resistance is a little bit longer, but Werewolf literally lasts 5 minutes. There's a timer, you know?
One night.
Yeah, I'm sorry, that's what I'm talking about, yeah. So one night, there's literally a 5-minute timer. And so, but nobody plays once. Like, everybody, you play for an hour or two, or, you know, like, so, yeah, I think
Nice too, because people come in, they're like, oh, what are you doing?
Yeah.
Like, oh, you can get in at 5 minutes.
in the office setting, definitely, yeah, it helps. But other games like, yeah, so generally I think the longer games are interesting, but like tougher to play. So I hate to, you know, because you have to find 4 other people that want to sit around a table for 6 hours. And that's a challenge. It's its own game. And then your other question was, winning. Yeah, so that's, again, I think my being drawn towards flavor so much helps with this, but like if I'm playing the game, like if the journey is interesting enough, if cool things are happening, then, you know, if I win or I don't win, you know, big deal. Like that's me. But it helps. What's interesting is like comparing that to like a video game, for example, where if I'm spending 6 hours on something like myself and I fail and I have to go start back at the beginning, no, I'm never playing that game again. But when you have other people sitting around a table, everybody, you know, it's casual. You're there to have fun, and maybe make an accomplishment or accomplish something, but maybe not. Yeah, it's interesting though that like, and this ties back to like the goal of the game, but there are these games now, particularly the Arkham brand, the whole Eldritch, you know, Lovecraftian board games, that the goal is not really to, I mean, the goal is to win, but like you shouldn't expect to, like, which is a weird premise for a game. So, yeah.
How do you feel about games like Risk Legacy, where a previous match will have a direct influence on future games?
I think I've played through a 15 game cycle of Risk Legacy, and I think it's a really interesting concept. It's a ton of fun. I haven't seen it done well enough where the concept is awesome, and I haven't found a game that executes it well enough. For my, like, to me, I played a lot of Risk, and I can't stand it now, and I'm kind of biased for that. But I think it's kind of a boring game, and Risk Legacy adds a ton of features, and the games are much faster, which help that. I had a lot of fun doing Risk Legacy. I really want to try Pandemic Legacy. I hear that's supposed to be an improvement, but it's kind of interesting because it's tough because it's no longer just a casual board game session, right? Like, this is a pre-planned, hopefully get the same group of people committing to 15 rounds of a game over how many weeks. Like, it's bigger than just a casual, relaxing, board game. To me, it's closer to the sort of commitments required by like a role-playing game like D&D or something like that. But I think they're great, and I'd like to see more of them because it feels cool to like destroy the board in one way or another. So yeah.
You talking about how you don't like Risk anymore? Like I like Risk, but I don't like the monotonous die rolling.
Yeah.
It's like, my 21 armies from Irkutsk to Yakutsk or whatever.
Irkutsk.
All right, So I think the topic of electronic board games is interesting because if you can just say, go calculate all the die rolls and where did I end up,
Right.
You skip all the boring part in some games. Like I've played electronic Risk, and I think it's more fun. It's definitely faster than playing with the board. And then I've played Ticket to Ride as well on iPad, so still in person with somebody, just passing it back and forth, and I found pretty fun too.
Yeah, and that's what
cards is easy,
Yeah, and like Risk, a lot of games, Monopoly, like these are games that were built before digital games existed in any way, shape, or form, right? So, like, I'm sure if they were invented now, like as computer games or as mobile phone games or whatever, like they would utilize those tools to roll the dice, do the bookkeeping, do all that stuff. So you're literally like parts of older games require you to do things manually that we wouldn't do in modern games. Except for either nostalgic purposes or because just it's a board game, not a computer game. And so that's something interesting where like games with tons of rules and tons of moving pieces, like there isn't a good digital Arkham Horror yet. or Elder Tour or any of those, which would be really, really nice if something would manage and tell me you forgot to do this, or so that's definitely an interesting. I mean, then you have games where the game can be played, without the component, but like Werewolf One Night, Resistance, like all these games have mobile apps that help you play by counting down, explaining what rolls need to do, and all that kind of stuff. But yeah, like when you take out having to roll 30 times because somebody just cashed in for 30, soldiers or whatever, like it certainly becomes a faster, more interesting game.
And then games like D&D are kind of maybe predicated on the idea that players like rolling dice.
Yeah, I think I can see that. The difference is, even though it's the same action every time, from the player's perspective, where I'm picking up a square or a cube and dropping it, or a hedron of some kind, it's always to do something a little different, right? Where like Risk, you will have 3 soldiers and 2 defenders, and just be like roll, 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 roll. So it's like the reward for succeeding on a roll seems to be delayed. Where it's like, because I agree, like I have a huge affection for dice. I mean, I play D&D, I play other like Star Wars role-playing games, like I do all that stuff, and I have my dice collection at home, and I love rolling them and buying a new set or doing whatever. But I think it's because the context is a little different, where I'm going to get a bigger variety of experience from them. But yeah, I mean, there's something to be said about just
the Risk example feels like almost administrative.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's a really good way of putting it. Which is why the digital thing helps so much.
There is a certain thing, like you say, though. There's like tension and like surprise when you're like, oh, can I get a 6? Like,
Oh yeah, that's why, like, if I'm running a D&D game or something, like, I don't want people using random number generators on the phone. Like, there's just boop 14. Like, that's great. Surprise is an element of the game, right? I mean, yeah, you're still surprised, but there's no build-up, there's no tension. It's just, as opposed to rolling, where you watch it tilt from that 18 to that 1, and that's
if you digitized Yahtzee, it would be largely trivial.
I mean, if you did, I bet it would literally just people playing to get a Yahtzee, so they could shout. Like, I'm convinced there's a whole genre of games just built around people wanting to shout the sorry, bingo, Yahtzee. Like, it's just people wanting to shout a funny word. Like, that's
like Pit. Two sheep, 2 sheep, 2, 2, 2.
Yeah.
Three.
Cool. I think the interesting example of the die rolling thing is that game Pass the Pigs, where like you're played Pass the Pigs. It's this game where like your dice are actually these little pigs, and you roll them, and they land in different positions, and you're scored based off the position.
Yeah.
Huh.
That's killer.
Yeah, I mean, so there you're combining like the administrative duty with like an actual fun shape, right? Like it's these are the tokens themselves. Yeah, that's good. I mean, yeah, I'm not saying that like dice rolling is bad at all. Like it's just anytime you're doing it because you're actually like, I want to complete this action, that's positive. If you're doing it because this is just the way that we have to do it because we don't have a phone or a calculator or something, that it can become cumbersome over time. If Risk was like Settlers of Catan, you roll once every single turn.
Yeah.
But it's also like, okay, that's fine. It's not like anytime you want to do something, you have to roll dice. Anytime like you want to do the same thing, it's not just, okay, then you're done. It doesn't require thought or attention. So, yeah. All right, awesome. I love games, so if anybody wants to talk on Friday 4 or whatever about game concepts, game design, anything, I'm your man. So, cool, thanks.